The world knew him as Lucky Luciano, a name whispered in alleys, boardrooms and newsrooms alike, a man who seemed to exist simultaneously in two realities. On one hand, he was the embodiment of the American dream, a self-made titan who carved order out of chaos and built a criminal empire that would endure long after his death. On the other, he was a symbol of violence, betrayal and moral ambiguity, a figure whose life blurred the line between genius and ruthlessness. This is the story of a man who not only survived the treacherous streets of New York but mastered them, turning instinct, ambition and charm into tools of power that reshaped an entire underworld. To understand Lucky Luciano, one must first understand the era he inhabited. The early 20th century was a time of profound transformation in America. Waves of immigrants poured into cities like New York, seeking opportunity but often finding only poverty, overcrowded tenements and systemic discrimination. It was a world where ambition collided with desperation, and where the strong and cunning often seized what others could only dream of. Within this turbulent environment, the young Salvatore Lucania, later known as Lucky Luciano, learned that survival depended on more than brute strength. It required intelligence, adaptability, and a keen understanding of human nature. Luciano's rise was not instantaneous. It was a careful, calculated ascent, shaped by both circumstance and choice. He was born into a modest Sicilian family in 1897, a world steeped in tradition, honor and unspoken rules of loyalty. Yet, the streets of Manhattan would teach him lessons no classroom could provide. Power was fluid, fear was a currency, and trust was a liability to be managed cautiously. The transformation from Salvatore Lucania, the streetwise immigrant boy, into Lucky Luciano, the orchestrator of a criminal empire, would involve not just ambition but a profound psychological evolution. He would learn to read people, to manipulate situations, and to anticipate threats long before they materialized. The city itself was both adversary and accomplice. Its crowded neighborhoods bred rivalries and alliances, a constant dance between cooperation and conflict. Gang wars erupted over territory, bootlegging and gambling, leaving bodies in the streets as grim reminders of what failure could bring. Yet within this chaos, Luciano saw opportunity. Where others saw danger, he saw systems waiting to be organized, networks waiting to be consolidated, and rules waiting to be rewritten. He did not merely react to his environment. He reshaped it, gradually imposing order on a world defined by disorder. This narrative is more than a recounting of events. It is a study in contrasts. Lucky's life was defined by dualities: charm and cruelty, loyalty and betrayal, vision and violence. Those who knew him personally often described a man of magnetic charisma, someone capable of inspiring fierce loyalty in his associates while simultaneously striking fear into rivals. It was this combination of qualities that allowed him to navigate a landscape rife with danger, ultimately positioning him at the pinnacle of organized crime. Yet for all his power, Luciano's world was precarious, built on alliances that could unravel at a moment's notice and on a code of conduct that was both protective and perilous. Even in his earliest criminal exploits, the seeds of his larger vision were evident. Luciano understood that brute force alone could never sustain an empire. To maintain long-term influence, he would need structure, strategy, and psychological insight. Every move he made was deliberate, every alliance a calculated investment, every act of violence a message designed to reinforce authority without unnecessary risk. His genius lay not merely in the accumulation of power but in the orchestration of it, transforming what might have been random chaos into an intricate, functioning system. And yet, even as he rose, there was an undeniable human element to his story, a man shaped by ambition, fear, and desire, navigating moral gray zones that tested his judgment and character. Luciano's life invites reflection on the nature of power itself. The intoxicating allure of control, the constant threat of betrayal, and the psychological toll of living in a world where one misstep could mean death. He was a figure who could inspire awe and horror in equal measure, a man whose life reads as both a cautionary tale and a testament to the audacity of vision. This is where the story begins, not merely with the man himself, but with the world that shaped him, the environment that demanded cunning, and the psychological landscape that allowed him to transform survival into dominion. From the crowded tenements of New York to the secretive backrooms of power, from petty street crimes to the orchestration of a criminal empire, Lucky Luciano's journey is a study in the cost of ambition, the price of power, and the enduring complexity of a man who dared to redefine the rules of the underworld. His story is not simply a recounting of events. It is an invitation to step into a world where morality is fluid, power is absolute, and every decision carries consequences that ripple far beyond the streets of his city. In the end, the myth and the man are inseparable. To speak of Lucky Luciano is to confront the seductive, terrifying, and often paradoxical nature of power itself. It is to witness the rise of a figure who could charm, intimidate, and outthink almost anyone, all while navigating a world defined by its unrelenting brutality. This is the stage upon which the drama of his life will unfold, a world where every choice is a gamble, every alliance a potential threat, and every moment a step closer to destiny or downfall. The story of Lucky Luciano cannot be told without first understanding the streets that shaped him. New York City at the turn of the 20th century was a maelstrom of chaos and opportunity, a living organism pulsing with the ambitions and struggles of millions of immigrants seeking a better life. The Lower East Side, where Luciano spent his formative years, was overcrowded, unsanitary, and rife with danger. Tenements stacked like cages, streets echoing with the cries of children, and a constant thrum of desperation created an environment that demanded resilience, cunning, and a keen sense of survival. This world was unforgiving, and it rewarded only those who could adapt, manipulate, or intimidate. Luciano arrived as Salvatore Lucania, the eldest son of Sicilian immigrants who carried with them the traditions, values, and secrets of their homeland. The Sicilian code of honor, loyalty, and secrecy, omerta, was an invisible thread woven into the daily life of the immigrant community. It was a world where family bonds mattered, but so did reputation, and where slights could not be ignored. These early lessons would imprint on Luciano, shaping his understanding of power and influence. He witnessed firsthand the fragility of trust and the weight of reputation, learning early that survival required both respect and fear in equal measure. The streets themselves were a classroom of a different sort. Gangs of youths roamed freely, their allegiances shifting like the tides. Violence was commonplace. Fistfights, muggings, and petty thefts were almost rites of passage. For a boy like Luciano, these encounters were both a threat and an education. He learned to size up opponents in seconds, to calculate risks, and to seize opportunities before anyone else noticed them. Every confrontation honed his instincts, teaching him the importance of presence, confidence, and decisiveness. In this crucible of survival, Luciano discovered that the rules of society applied only when convenient, and that power often belonged to those who could bend those rules to their advantage. Poverty was pervasive, and the struggle to provide for family was constant. Many young men succumbed to despair or drifted into petty criminality without purpose. Luciano, however, possessed a rare combination of ambition and intellect that set him apart. While others saw only limitations, he saw openings, gaps in the system where cunning and audacity could create opportunity. He was observant, always watching the ebb and flow of the neighborhood, the comings and goings of influential figures, the undercurrents of illicit business, the alliances forming and dissolving with each passing day. These observations would become invaluable later, forming the blueprint for his rise in the underworld. The immigrant experience itself added another layer of complexity to Luciano's environment. Italian families, while close-knit, were often marginalized by broader society. Discrimination in schools, workplaces, and public spaces instilled both a sense of outsider status and a determination to succeed despite systemic obstacles. Luciano learned early that one's appearance, charm, and intellect could be as powerful as brute force. To navigate a world stacked against him, he would need to be adaptable, persuasive, and at times ruthless, a triad of qualities that would define his approach to power for the rest of his life. Yet it was not merely survival that drove him. Ambition burned within him from a young age. While many of his peers were content with petty crime or small-scale hustles, Luciano dreamed bigger. He envisioned influence, authority, and control, elements that extended far beyond the alleyways and tenements of his youth. These dreams were not naive. They were grounded in an acute awareness of human behavior, social dynamics, and the emerging structures of organized crime in New York. Luciano began to recognize that the city's chaos could be transformed into opportunity if one possessed the foresight, strategy, and nerve to seize it. Education, though limited, also played a role in shaping Luciano. Though he did not excel academically, he was perceptive and quick-witted, absorbing lessons from life itself. He learned the value of reading people, understanding motives, and predicting behavior, a psychological acumen that would later prove essential in managing allies, rivals, and enemies alike. Street smarts became his currency, a form of intelligence that textbooks could not provide. In essence, the Lower East Side was both adversary and mentor, offering harsh lessons that would forge Luciano into a man capable of commanding respect in a world ruled by violence and cunning. Social networks formed in these early years also provided critical stepping stones. Luciano observed older men who commanded loyalty and influence through a combination of fear and strategy. He learned that alliances, even fragile ones, could multiply power exponentially if managed correctly. These insights would later allow him to navigate the complex landscape of the American Mafia, where friendships were provisional, and betrayal lurked around every corner. In many ways, the streets of New York were a laboratory, and Luciano was an astute student conducting experiments in power, loyalty, and survival. Amid the noise, poverty, and danger, a psychological evolution was taking place. Luciano developed a duality, an outward charm and politeness masking a calculating, often ruthless mind. He became adept at assessing character, anticipating threats, and turning situations to his advantage. The environment demanded it. Trust was precious, loyalty conditional, and weakness exploited without hesitation. By the time he left adolescence behind, Luciano was no longer just a survivor. He was a strategist, a tactician, and a man beginning to envision a future defined not by circumstance, but by his own design. By the time he stepped fully into the adult world of organized crime, the streets of his youth had done more than toughen him. They had taught him the anatomy of power. He understood the importance of perception, the leverage of information, and the subtle balance between intimidation and persuasion. Every street corner, every alley, every encounter contributed to the man who would eventually dominate the American Mafia. In this way, the Lower East Side was not merely a backdrop for his early life, it was the forge in which Lucky Luciano was tempered, the environment that shaped not just his methods, but his psychology, ambitions, and vision. In essence, Luciano's formative years were a microcosm of the challenges and possibilities of the immigrant experience in early 20th century America. Poverty, danger, marginalization, and opportunity collided to create a young man who was resilient, perceptive, and endlessly ambitious. These streets were unforgiving, but for those willing to learn, to adapt, and to assert themselves, they were also a proving ground. Lucky Luciano would emerge from this crucible not just as a survivor, but as a figure capable of redefining power itself. A man whose destiny was being quietly written in the alleys, tenements, and hidden corners of New York City. By the time Salvatore Lucania reached his teenage years, the streets of New York had already begun to shape not just his behavior but his worldview. The chaos of the Lower East Side, with its crowded tenements, rival gangs, and constant struggle for survival, had taught him that life was not fair, and that power was something to be seized rather than begged for. Yet what set him apart from his peers was not merely a desire to survive, it was an innate hunger to dominate, to organize, and to rise above the chaos that defined his environment. From a young age, Luciano displayed a rare combination of audacity and strategic thinking, a psychological profile that would later distinguish him as the architect of the modern American Mafia. Luciano's early crimes were small-scale but telling. Petty thefts, street hustles, and fights in schoolyards were not acts of rebellion. They were exercises in observation, learning, and testing limits. Each confrontation offered insight into human behavior, social dynamics, and the mechanisms of fear and respect. He quickly realized that brute strength alone was insufficient. The most effective leverage came from a mixture of cunning, timing, and perception. By watching older gang members navigate the underworld, Luciano began to internalize the rules of power, anticipate threats before they arrive, exploit weaknesses without hesitation, and always maintain an image that commands respect. What made Luciano particularly dangerous, even as a teenager, was his ability to mask ambition with charm. He could appear affable, deferential, even naive, while secretly calculating the next move that would advance his position. This duality became his signature trait, the capacity to disarm, manipulate, and influence without revealing his full intentions. In a world where alliances were fleeting and betrayal was a constant threat, this psychological sophistication gave him a distinct edge. Whereas many of his contemporaries relied solely on violence, Luciano's early approach combined intellect with intimidation, a subtle yet potent mixture that would define his rise. Family dynamics also played a crucial role in shaping his early strategies. Raised in a household steeped in Sicilian traditions, Luciano understood the value of loyalty, respect, and hierarchy. Yet he also observed the limitations imposed by rigid adherence to rules, recognizing that flexibility and pragmatism often yielded greater advantage. These lessons would later inform his approach to organized crime. Loyalty was essential, but it had to be managed, negotiated, and sometimes sacrificed for the greater good of the enterprise. Even in adolescence, Luciano was learning that power was not merely physical. It was relational, psychological, and strategic. School provided another battlefield for Luciano's developing mind. Though not a model student academically, he excelled in navigating social hierarchies, reading intentions and exploiting situations to his benefit. Bullies, teachers, and classmates alike became opportunities for experimentation in influence and control. He learned to identify weaknesses, predict reactions, and manipulate outcomes, skills that would later translate seamlessly into managing criminal alliances, negotiating with rivals, and orchestrating complex schemes. In essence, every street corner, every schoolyard, and every encounter was a rehearsal for the world of organized crime he would soon enter. It was during these years that Luciano began to form his earliest alliances, testing loyalty and observing human behavior under pressure. Friends were evaluated not merely for companionship, but for usefulness, reliability, and temperament. Betrayal, he quickly understood, could be fatal, and trust was a commodity to be rationed carefully. These formative experiences were crucial in shaping the psychological foundation of a man who would later command entire criminal networks with both fear and respect. In a sense, Luciano's adolescence was a laboratory in which the principles of power, influence, and loyalty were being experimentally applied and refined. Violence, though never his preferred tool, became a language he understood fluently. Fights were not random, they were calculated expressions of dominance, tests of courage, and lessons in consequences. Luciano learned to choose when to act with aggression and when to leverage intellect, charm, or intimidation. This ability to balance violence with psychological insight allowed him to navigate a treacherous environment more effectively than peers who relied solely on force. Each encounter reinforced a growing awareness: in a world of predators, only the cunning survive. Luciano's early life was also marked by exposure to the first glimpses of organized criminal operations. The neighborhoods teemed with illicit activities: gambling dens, small-time bootlegging, protection rackets, and neighborhood extortion. Observing these operations offered him practical lessons in enterprise, risk management, and the mechanics of influence. He noted the patterns, hierarchies, and strategies employed by older criminals, internalizing the importance of structure, discipline, and strategic foresight. Even at a young age, Luciano was beginning to think like an architect of organized crime, recognizing that small, disorganized gangs could evolve into enduring, profitable enterprises with the right leadership. Ambition, however, was only part of the equation. Luciano possessed an uncanny psychological adaptability that allowed him to navigate conflicting pressures and emerging threats. The streets of New York were unpredictable, and survival required constant assessment of allies, rivals, and environmental shifts. Luciano's mind was constantly engaged in a complex calculus: who could be trusted, who posed a threat, and which opportunities could be exploited. By learning to think several steps ahead, he positioned himself as a young man whose potential for influence extended far beyond his immediate circumstances. Romance, camaraderie, and the occasional indulgence in the pleasures of youth provided a counterpoint to this calculated existence, yet they never distracted him from his broader goals. These social interactions became another domain for psychological observation, allowing him to test charisma, loyalty, and social leverage. Every relationship, whether fleeting or enduring, was evaluated for its potential contribution to his ascent. By balancing charm with ambition, he honed an interpersonal intelligence that would become as vital as any weapon in his arsenal. By the end of his adolescence, the transformation from Salvatore Lucania to Lucky Luciano was already underway. The traits that would define his later life: strategic vision, psychological acuity, ability to manipulate and inspire loyalty, and a calculated approach to violence, were all emerging clearly. He was no longer merely a streetwise kid. He was a tactician, a manipulator, and a nascent leader in an environment that rewarded those qualities above all else. The streets had forged him, the schools and tenements had educated him, and the neighborhood gangs had tested him. The lessons of his youth would not be forgotten. They would become the foundation upon which he would construct an empire. In sum, Luciano's teenage years were a crucible in which his psychological, strategic, and moral framework was forged. He learned to balance audacity with prudence, charm with intimidation, and loyalty with self-interest. Every observation, confrontation, and alliance contributed to a growing mastery of human behavior, power, and influence. By the time he stepped into the adult world of organized crime, Luciano was not simply prepared to survive. He was prepared to dominate, innovate, and reshape the very rules of the underworld. These early years were not just formative, they were decisive, setting the trajectory for a man who would come to embody the apex of ambition and the complex psychology of power. Before Lucky Luciano could consolidate power, he had to navigate a landscape defined by chaos, rivalry, and constant bloodshed. The New York underworld of the early 20th century was not an organized system. It was a fragmented battlefield, a world of competing factions, volatile alliances, and brutal vendettas. 5 crime families, each fiercely territorial, jostled for dominance, while smaller gangs scurried for scraps of influence. Violence was omnipresent, and trust was a scarce commodity. This environment, unpredictable and deadly, provided both a crucible and an opportunity for a mind like Luciano's, one that thrived on strategy, foresight, and psychological acumen. At the time, organized crime was not yet a business. It was an anarchic exercise in survival. Rackets were managed haphazardly, disputes were settled with bullets rather than negotiation, and leadership often depended on brute strength rather than vision. These chaotic dynamics created constant instability, leaving openings for ambitious figures to consolidate power and impose order. Luciano, with his blend of intellect, ambition, and ruthlessness, was uniquely positioned to exploit these fractures. Where others saw risk, he saw structure waiting to be implemented, alliances to be brokered, and a blueprint for control that could elevate him above mere survival. The street wars were relentless. Gangs fought over neighborhoods, gambling operations, and extortion rackets, leaving a trail of corpses and terror in their wake. Each family operated like a microcosm of power, with its own rules, loyalties, and hierarchies, yet these structures were fragile, subject to internal betrayal and external pressure. The violence was not just physical, it was psychological. Fear was weaponized and reputations were carefully curated. Luciano quickly absorbed these lessons, understanding that power was not just the result of muscle but of perception, influence, and strategic alliances. One of the critical dynamics of this era was the role of ethnic networks. Italian immigrants dominated certain neighborhoods and industries, while Jewish, Irish, and other immigrant groups controlled others. This segmentation meant that any aspiring leader had to navigate not just rival Italian factions but also external competitors, each with their own codes and methods. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to transcend these divisions, forging alliances across ethnic and organizational lines, and positioning himself as a bridge capable of consolidating fragmented power. By recognizing that collaboration could yield more profit than constant warfare, he began to think in terms of a broader, systemic approach rather than immediate, localized gain. It was also a time when law enforcement was struggling to keep pace. Police corruption, limited resources, and political complicity meant that criminal operations often operated with impunity. For ambitious figures like Luciano, this environment presented both opportunity and hazard. Navigating these layers of law and politics required not just muscle but diplomacy, calculation, and an understanding of human motivations at every level. Luciano's early exposure to these dynamics sharpened his instincts. He recognized that the path to dominance was not through indiscriminate violence alone, but through strategic manipulation, negotiation, and the occasional demonstration of force that sent a calculated message. The so-called War of the Families was not just a series of isolated skirmishes, it was a war of psychology and perception. Each act of violence had consequences that rippled through the underworld, influencing alliances, fear, and loyalty. Luciano observed, learned, and calculated his moves carefully. While others were consumed by immediate revenge or territorial disputes, he was thinking several steps ahead, considering not only the present skirmish but the long-term architecture of power. He began to see that the families themselves could be restructured, that chaos could be converted into organized enterprise, and that his vision could extend far beyond the narrow street corners of his youth. Amid this turbulence, Luciano developed a reputation that was both feared and respected. He was neither the largest nor the most violent figure at the time, but his intelligence, composure, and ability to navigate treacherous alliances made him a rising star. Rivals and allies alike recognized that he was different, not impulsive, not reckless, but calculating, strategic, and audacious. His psychological insight became as powerful as any weapon. He understood when to strike, when to negotiate, and when to intimidate. This balance between charm, intellect, and ruthlessness allowed him to maneuver in a world where impulsive aggression often led to ruin. This era also revealed the moral complexity of the underworld. Violence and betrayal were endemic, yet there were codes, traditions, and unwritten rules that guided behavior. Loyalty was demanded but conditional. Respect had to be earned but could be swiftly revoked. Luciano absorbed these lessons, internalizing the delicate balance between fear and loyalty that would define his leadership style. He understood that to consolidate power, he needed not only to survive the immediate conflicts but also to cultivate influence, manage perception, and gradually impose order on a world that had operated without it for decades. Ultimately, the fragmented nature of the underworld served as both challenge and education. Luciano's rise was not simply the result of ambition. It was the product of a keen psychological acumen, a strategic mind, and an ability to see patterns where others saw only chaos. He recognized that dominance required more than violence. It required organization, foresight, and an ability to manipulate human behavior. By learning the intricate dynamics of the families, their rivalries, and the broader criminal ecosystem, Luciano positioned himself not merely as a participant in the War of the Families, but as a future architect of a more ordered, profitable, and enduring criminal empire. In this crucible of blood, fear, and opportunity, Luciano was being forged. The streets taught him the harshest lessons, the rivalries provided tactical insight, and the chaos offered a canvas on which his ambitions could take shape. By the time he began to assert himself within the families, he was already thinking like a strategist, envisioning not just conquest but the creation of an entirely new system, one that would redefine organized crime in America. The War of the Families was more than a prelude. It was the proving ground that transformed a street-smart youth into a visionary who would later impose order, consolidate power, and leave a legacy that would echo long after the bullets had stopped flying. By the time Lucky Luciano entered his early 20s, the streets of New York had already molded him into a calculating, ambitious, and psychologically astute operator. But surviving the chaos of the underworld was only the first step. To rise, he needed strategy, vision, and a willingness to act decisively when opportunity presented itself. The early moves that would define his ascent were as much about timing, alliances, and perception as they were about violence. Luciano understood that in a world governed by fear, respect, and reputation, the first impression could shape the trajectory of a lifetime. Luciano's initial strategy was subtle but deliberate. Rather than seeking immediate dominance through open confrontation, he focused on building relationships with influential figures across the fragmented criminal landscape. He recognized that alliances were the currency of power and that loyalty, even if tenuous, could be leveraged to create long-term advantage. He observed rivalries, gauged temperament, and identified individuals whose skills, connections, or temperament complemented his own. Each association was meticulously evaluated. Some would serve as allies, others as pawns, and still others as potential threats to be neutralized. One of Luciano's early and most important lessons came from observing older mobsters who relied primarily on brute force. While they wielded violence with confidence, their methods were often short-sighted, reactive, and unsustainable. Luciano, by contrast, understood that power could be multiplied through strategy, negotiation, and psychological manipulation. Violence was a tool, not a solution. Intimidation could be deployed to shape behavior without destroying valuable networks. He began to refine a delicate balance between charm, fear, and respect, a triad that would become his hallmark. In these formative years, Luciano also recognized the importance of optics. Reputation in the underworld was as tangible a weapon as any firearm. He cultivated an image of composure, decisiveness, and controlled ruthlessness, ensuring that both allies and rivals understood that he was neither impulsive nor weak. Every public act, from a minor confrontation to a display of generosity toward his associates, was carefully calibrated to reinforce perception. In this way, he manipulated not only immediate outcomes but also long-term psychological dynamics, sowing respect and caution in equal measure. Luciano's early operations were diverse, spanning petty extortion, gambling, and the nascent networks of bootlegging during Prohibition. Unlike many of his contemporaries who operated in isolation or small volatile crews, Luciano sought to create integrated systems. He envisioned a network where each element reinforced the others, where influence, revenue, and protection formed an interconnected structure rather than disjointed ventures. This systems-oriented mindset, rare in the chaotic underworld of the time, allowed him to maximize efficiency, minimize unnecessary conflict, and expand his influence with remarkable speed. Strategic alliances played a pivotal role in his rise. Luciano understood that enemies could often become allies if interests aligned. He cultivated relationships with other ambitious mobsters, carefully negotiating terms that benefited both parties while leaving him positioned to assert dominance if necessary. These alliances were rarely permanent. They were pragmatic, flexible arrangements designed to achieve immediate objectives while preserving options for the future. This fluid approach to loyalty and partnership allowed Luciano to operate with a degree of freedom and foresight that most of his contemporaries lacked. Betrayal, too, was a tool to be used judiciously. Luciano's psychological insight extended to predicting human behavior, who might waver under pressure, who could be swayed with incentives, and who posed a latent threat. He recognized that timing was everything. Betrayal executed too early could provoke retaliation, while patience could yield strategic advantage. This calculated approach to trust and treachery allowed him to consolidate influence without unnecessary bloodshed, preserving relationships that were essential to the growth of his emerging empire. During this period, Luciano also began to appreciate the interplay between organized crime and legitimate society. Political figures, law enforcement, and business leaders were not merely obstacles. They were potential allies, leverage points, or pawns in a broader game of influence. Luciano's early dealings demonstrated an instinctive understanding of this dynamic. Subtle bribery, strategic information sharing, and behind-the-scenes negotiation became tools for advancing his position. He was not just a street-level operator. He was a strategist capable of manipulating multiple layers of society simultaneously. Another hallmark of his early moves was his focus on consolidation rather than fragmentation. Many contemporaries were content to carve out isolated fiefdoms, protecting a narrow slice of territory or revenue. Luciano, by contrast, envisioned integration, controlling disparate operations, mediating conflicts, and imposing a form of centralized oversight that increased efficiency and reduced risk. He began to implement systems of accountability among his associates, ensuring that operations were not merely profitable but sustainable, and that loyalty could be monitored and reinforced without constant oversight. This early emphasis on structure and organization foreshadowed the revolutionary changes he would later bring to the American Mafia. Luciano's strategic insight extended even to the selection of associates. He valued competence, reliability, and psychological acumen over brute force alone. Trusted lieutenants were chosen not simply for loyalty, but for their ability to execute complex operations, manage networks of influence, and anticipate challenges. This selective cultivation of talent allowed Luciano to expand rapidly, maintaining operational control even as his scope of influence grew. By surrounding himself with capable individuals who shared his vision, he created a multiplier effect, amplifying his power beyond what he could achieve alone. Perhaps most importantly, Luciano's early moves demonstrated his ability to think several steps ahead. While rivals were often reactive, responding impulsively to threats or opportunities, Luciano acted with foresight. Every decision, whether an alliance, a confrontation, or an investment, was evaluated not only for immediate gain but for its ripple effects across networks of power, perception, and loyalty. He understood that dominance was not a single event but a cumulative process, and that patience, timing, and psychological insight were as vital as courage and ambition. By the end of this formative period, Luciano had transformed from a streetwise youth into a rising power broker within the underworld. His early moves, strategic alliances, calculated intimidation, and systems-oriented thinking, laid the foundation for his eventual dominance. The chaotic landscape of New York's criminal world had provided the perfect environment for his talents to flourish, and he had seized the opportunity with precision, intelligence, and audacity. In essence, Luciano's early moves were not the acts of a reckless youth. They were the deliberate, calculated steps of a strategist building an empire. Violence was employed judiciously, alliances were negotiated with foresight, and perception was managed with meticulous care. He was learning the art of power in its most complex form, combining psychological insight, strategic vision, and organizational acumen into a formula that would ultimately reshape organized crime in America. These years were not merely preparatory, they were the crucible in which the architect of the modern American Mafia was forged. By the mid-1920s, Lucky Luciano had established himself as a force to be reckoned with in New York's chaotic underworld. But ambition alone was not enough. To cement lasting power, he needed more than alliances, influence, and fear. He needed structure. While most mobsters relied on brute force and volatile loyalties, Luciano saw the potential for something revolutionary. A criminal organization that functioned not as a collection of violent factions, but as a disciplined, interconnected enterprise. It was a vision that would redefine the American Mafia, turning chaos into an empire, and establishing a model of power that would endure for decades. Luciano's first step was organizational innovation. He recognized that the traditional mafia, fractured into feuding families and loosely allied gangs, was inherently unstable. Rivalries, vendettas, and personal grudges threatened continuity, making long-term planning nearly impossible. Violence, while often effective in the short term, was unsustainable if the goal was enduring power. Luciano's genius was to impose structure where none had existed, to design a hierarchy that maintained authority while delegating operational responsibility to trusted lieutenants. This allowed him to expand influence without micromanaging every street corner or gambling den. At the heart of his reorganization was the concept of the Commission, a governing council designed to mediate disputes, coordinate operations, and allocate territories among families. This innovation was not merely administrative, it was profoundly psychological. By creating a formalized system for negotiation and conflict resolution, Luciano reduced internal bloodshed and fostered a culture of accountability. He transformed the Mafia from a volatile collection of independent actors into a networked enterprise in which loyalty was codified, respect was enforced, and the costs of betrayal were clearly defined. The Commission became both a symbol and a tool of his vision, ensuring that power was centralized without appearing dictatorial, a delicate balance of authority and influence that few had achieved before him. Luciano also redefined the operational structure of the families under his influence. Each division of his empire, gambling, bootlegging, prostitution, labor rackets, was carefully managed and compartmentalized, ensuring efficiency and accountability. Responsibilities were delegated to trusted captains and lieutenants, individuals chosen not merely for loyalty, but for competence, psychological acuity, and reliability. This approach mirrored legitimate business practices, creating a chain of command that allowed Luciano to oversee expansive operations without losing control. His understanding of organizational dynamics was unprecedented in the criminal underworld, and it gave him a strategic edge over rivals who still relied on personal intimidation alone. A key component of his empire building was the deliberate cultivation of relationships both within and outside the Mafia. Luciano understood that power did not exist in isolation. It required influence over politicians, law enforcement, and business figures who could serve as allies, enforcers, or sources of intelligence. Bribes, strategic information sharing, and carefully orchestrated displays of loyalty became tools in his expanding toolkit. By embedding his influence into multiple layers of society, Luciano created a network that was resilient, adaptive, and difficult to disrupt. His vision was both practical and psychological. He needed enemies to fear him, allies to trust him, and the broader society to underestimate his reach. Luciano's transformation of the Mafia also relied on his understanding of human psychology. He realized that fear alone could enforce compliance but could not sustain loyalty. Respect, opportunity, and mutual benefit were equally important. Associates were rewarded for performance, protected from unnecessary danger, and given a sense of purpose within the larger system. Betrayal was met with swift retribution, but these actions were carefully calculated to send clear messages rather than incite uncontrolled chaos. In essence, Luciano turned the Mafia into an organization that could motivate, control, and manipulate human behavior on a large scale, a psychological enterprise as much as a criminal one. This period also highlighted his capacity for innovation. Luciano introduced practices that were unheard of in the underworld: standardized methods for dispute resolution, coordinated operations across multiple families, and centralized oversight of revenue streams. He integrated emerging industries such as bootlegging during Prohibition into structured networks that maximized profit while minimizing risk. He also developed early methods for intelligence gathering, surveillance, and negotiation, ensuring that he remained several steps ahead of both rivals and law enforcement. His approach combined ruthless pragmatism with visionary foresight, allowing him to operate in a complex and often hostile environment with remarkable efficiency. Importantly, Luciano's empire was not solely a matter of money or territory, it was a demonstration of control and influence. He understood that perception mattered as much as reality. By consolidating power, mediating disputes, and imposing order on the chaotic underworld, he positioned himself as the central authority in a landscape that had previously been leaderless. Rivals and allies alike recognized the shift. To challenge Luciano was not merely to risk death, but to confront an entire system of influence, intelligence, and organization. In this way, he transformed power from a personal attribute into a systemic force. The reorganization also allowed Luciano to manage risk more effectively. By delegating authority and compartmentalizing operations, he insulated himself from legal exposure, internal betrayal, and operational failure. No single lieutenant held the full picture, ensuring that even in the event of disruption, the system remained resilient. This approach mirrored the corporate structures of legitimate enterprises, demonstrating an extraordinary ability to blend criminal innovation with practical management principles. It was a level of sophistication that distinguished him from virtually every contemporary in the underworld. By the late 1920s, the impact of Luciano's organizational genius was evident. The once fractured Mafia now operated with unprecedented efficiency, discipline, and coordination. Families that had previously been in constant conflict began to cooperate under the framework he had designed. Revenue streams became predictable, territories stabilized, and internal violence declined, replaced by negotiation, strategy, and calculated enforcement. In essence, Luciano had transformed the Mafia from a chaotic, reactionary system into a disciplined, profit-oriented empire, one that could rival legitimate businesses in its scope, sophistication, and resilience. Yet this transformation was as much psychological as it was structural. Luciano's vision imposed a new order on human behavior, codifying loyalty, fear, and respect into an operable system. He created an environment where associates understood both the rewards of compliance and the consequences of betrayal. He demonstrated that power could be managed, structured, and sustained, an insight that few in the underworld had grasped. Through this combination of organizational design, psychological mastery, and strategic foresight, Luciano not only consolidated his own authority but reshaped the very rules of engagement in organized crime. By the end of this period, Lucky Luciano had emerged not merely as a powerful mobster, but as a revolutionary architect of organized crime. His innovations in structure, delegation, and strategy created a durable system that could endure beyond the lifespan of any individual. The chaotic streets of New York had produced a master strategist, one capable of imposing order on disorder, consolidating power from fragmentation, and transforming an anarchic underworld into a sophisticated, business-like enterprise. In doing so, Luciano laid the foundation for a new era in organized crime, one defined not only by violence and fear but by intelligence, organization, and vision. In the underworld, rules exist, but they are unwritten, enforced not by law but by fear, tradition, and an exacting code of honor. For Lucky Luciano, understanding and mastering this psychological framework was as vital as any strategy, alliance, or violent display of power. At the heart of this system was omerta, the code of silence that governed behavior, dictated loyalty, and maintained order within the Mafia. It was a moral and psychological contract that bound associates together, while also serving as a weapon against enemies. Mastery of this code was not merely about survival, it was about shaping human behavior to reinforce authority, instill fear, and sustain an empire. Omerta demanded total loyalty and absolute discretion. Words could be weapons, and a single misstep, a careless comment, a betrayal, or a public insult, could have deadly consequences. For Luciano, this code was both shield and sword. He used it to enforce discipline within his ranks, ensuring that associates understood the price of betrayal and the value of allegiance. But he also recognized its limits. He manipulated the code strategically, allowing for flexibility when necessary to consolidate power, neutralize threats, or form alliances. It was this balance between rigid enforcement and calculated pragmatism that made him a master of psychological control. The code extended beyond mere silence. It dictated behavior, loyalty, and hierarchy, creating a framework in which each member of the organization understood their role, obligations, and limits. Fear was a necessary component, but it was reinforced by respect and opportunity. Associates were rewarded for competence, discretion, and loyalty, yet punished swiftly and decisively for deviation. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to calibrate these forces with precision. Too much fear could incite rebellion, too much leniency could invite betrayal. He learned to wield both, ensuring that the balance of power reinforced his dominance while maintaining operational stability. Understanding omerta also required deep insight into human psychology. Luciano recognized that people were motivated not only by fear or loyalty but by status, ambition, and self-interest. He cultivated an environment in which individuals could achieve personal gain while remaining bound by the code, creating a network in which incentives aligned with organizational goals. By shaping behavior through both rewards and consequences, he transformed omerta from a rigid moral principle into a practical tool for governance. In essence, the code became an instrument of control, turning human psychology into a mechanism for maintaining power. Luciano's interpretation of the code was revolutionary in its pragmatism. While older mobsters often enforced omerta as an absolute moral imperative, he approached it as a strategic framework. He understood that the ultimate goal was not blind obedience but functional loyalty, behavior that served the interests of the organization and, ultimately, himself. This subtle shift allowed him to consolidate power across multiple families, mediate disputes, and build a system in which fear, respect, and opportunity were carefully balanced. It was not merely adherence to tradition, it was the application of psychology to create a sustainable structure of authority. The enforcement of omerta was both subtle and violent. Luciano often relied on calculated displays of punishment to reinforce the code, sending clear messages without destabilizing the system. Assassinations, beatings, and public humiliations were deployed with precision, ensuring that the consequences of betrayal were visible but measured. Simultaneously, loyalty and competence were rewarded, demonstrating that adherence to the code was both necessary and beneficial. This dual approach, fear and reward, allowed Luciano to maintain a culture of discipline and predictability in an otherwise chaotic underworld. Omerta also served as a protective barrier against law enforcement and external threats. By ensuring silence and discretion within the organization, Luciano reduced exposure to investigation, infiltration, and betrayal. Associates understood that speaking out could result in death, and this fear reinforced both operational security and internal cohesion. Beyond its practical benefits, the code reinforced a psychological hierarchy in which Luciano's authority was unassailable. He was not merely a leader by force. He was a master of perception, ensuring that his control over the organization was both recognized and feared. Yet the code was not static. Luciano adapted it to meet the evolving demands of his empire. As operations expanded across territories and industries, strict adherence to rigid rules could hinder efficiency. He introduced flexibility, allowing associates to exercise judgment while remaining within the boundaries of loyalty and discretion. This innovation ensured that omerta remained a living system, capable of guiding behavior in a complex and changing environment. By blending tradition with pragmatism, Luciano created a psychological architecture that reinforced both loyalty and operational effectiveness. The code's influence extended beyond the organization into the broader culture of fear and respect that defined the Mafia's public image. Rivals, law enforcement, and political figures understood that the principles of omerta were enforced with ruthless consistency. Knowledge of this enforcement amplified the psychological power of the organization, deterring aggression and fostering a climate in which Luciano's authority could flourish. Fear, respect, and loyalty became mutually reinforcing forces, ensuring that the empire he built was both stable and formidable. In essence, omerta under Luciano was more than a code of conduct. It was a carefully engineered system of psychological control. It dictated how people behaved, how they related to one another, and how power was maintained. Luciano's mastery of this code allowed him to manipulate human behavior on a scale rarely seen in the underworld. Associates were disciplined but motivated, fearful but loyal, constrained but empowered. It was a sophisticated interplay of human psychology and organizational design, transforming the Mafia into a system in which order, loyalty, and fear were calibrated for maximum effectiveness. By fully internalizing and innovating within this framework, Luciano not only reinforced his own authority but laid the groundwork for a new model of organized crime. The Mafia became more than a collection of violent gangs. It became an organization capable of coordination, longevity, and psychological dominance. Omerta, under Luciano's guidance, was no longer merely tradition. It was strategy, governance, and psychological architecture. It was the invisible force that bound his empire together, ensuring that loyalty and fear were always in balance, and that his authority remained unchallenged even amid the turbulence of the criminal underworld. In these ways, the Code of Omerta exemplified Luciano's genius. It was at once moral, psychological, and strategic, a living system that governed behavior, reinforced loyalty, and created a framework within which his empire could thrive. By understanding, enforcing, and innovating upon this code, Luciano transformed the Mafia into an organization that was disciplined, cohesive, and enduring. Omerta became not just a set of rules but the backbone of his empire, a tool of psychological control that ensured stability, authority, and the perpetuation of power. By the late 1920s, Lucky Luciano had moved beyond the realm of street-level influence and was now orchestrating an empire with unprecedented scope and sophistication. What distinguished him from his predecessors was not merely ambition or ruthlessness, but an acute understanding of economics, logistics, and human behavior. Organized crime under Luciano was no longer a series of fragmented, violent skirmishes. It was a structured enterprise that generated predictable revenue streams, mitigated risk, and leveraged both fear and influence to consolidate power. To fully understand the scope of his genius, it is necessary to examine the mechanics of his empire, the businesses, operations, and strategic decisions that transformed illicit activity into organized, profit-driven ventures. Central to Luciano's operations was the realization that crime could be systematized. Gambling dens, nightclubs, bootlegging networks, and prostitution rings were no longer isolated enterprises. They were interconnected, coordinated, and efficiently managed. He recognized that the chaotic approach of older mobsters, who treated crime as episodic and reactive, was inherently limited. By integrating these operations under a unified management system, Luciano increased efficiency, minimized internal conflict, and maximized profit. Each operation served a specific function, and collectively they formed an interlocking network of revenue, influence, and control. Bootlegging during Prohibition was perhaps the most visible and lucrative component of his empire. While many gangs operated independently, Luciano implemented a system of oversight, distribution, and conflict resolution that allowed multiple families to profit without destroying one another. He mediated territorial disputes, coordinated supply chains, and ensured that distribution networks were efficient and secure. This strategic oversight not only increased revenue but also reduced violence, demonstrating his belief that profit and stability were more valuable than unrestrained aggression. In essence, Luciano treated bootlegging like a corporate enterprise, optimizing operations for both profitability and sustainability. Gambling operations were similarly sophisticated. Rather than leaving each gambling den to the whim of individual operators, Luciano established structured oversight and revenue reporting. Associates were accountable for their territories, and profits were systematically funneled to central leadership. This approach allowed him to monitor performance, enforce discipline, and identify both opportunities and threats. By applying principles of organization and accountability to illicit activity, he created a system that operated predictably and efficiently, a revolutionary concept in the underworld, where disorder and impulsivity had previously dominated. Prostitution rings and labor rackets further exemplified his strategic acumen. Luciano recognized that these operations could be managed like conventional businesses, with employees, supervisors, and systematic methods for extracting revenue while mitigating risk. He introduced structure into environments previously governed by informal agreements and ad hoc enforcement. By standardizing operations, assigning trustworthy lieutenants, and enforcing discipline through a combination of fear and reward, Luciano ensured that these ventures contributed to the empire's profitability without destabilizing it. He was creating a criminal ecosystem in which each component reinforced the others, generating both wealth and influence. Luciano's genius extended beyond mere operational oversight. He understood the importance of perception, influence, and reputation in shaping outcomes. Associates were incentivized through profit sharing and opportunities for advancement, creating a culture of loyalty and motivation. Rivals and law enforcement were managed through a combination of intimidation, bribery, and strategic alliances. Information became a tool of power. Intelligence about rival operations, police investigations, and market conditions allowed him to anticipate threats and exploit opportunities before anyone else. In effect, Luciano was practicing high-level risk management, applying principles of strategy and psychology to criminal enterprise. The integration of disparate operations also enabled Luciano to enforce discipline and maintain control without constant oversight. By delegating authority to trusted lieutenants who understood both the business and the psychological principles underpinning loyalty, he could extend his influence across multiple industries and neighborhoods simultaneously. This decentralized control, combined with centralized strategic oversight, created resilience. Even if one element of the network failed, the system as a whole remained functional. Such a structure mirrored legitimate corporate models, illustrating Luciano's ability to adapt principles of enterprise to illicit activity. Labor rackets, in particular, showcased Luciano's skill at blending coercion with opportunity. By controlling unions and workforces, he not only extracted revenue through extortion and bribery, but also exerted influence over legitimate industries. Business owners were compelled to comply with his demands, while workers were coerced or incentivized to maintain stability. This interplay between legal and illegal spheres demonstrated an advanced understanding of leverage, power dynamics, and negotiation. Luciano was not merely running a criminal enterprise, he was manipulating a hybrid economy in which every decision rippled through multiple layers of society. One of the most remarkable aspects of Luciano's empire was its adaptability. He understood that success required constant vigilance and the ability to anticipate shifts in the environment. Changes in law enforcement, market conditions, and rival strategies demanded nimbleness. Luciano's system was flexible enough to absorb shocks, redistribute resources, and adapt to new threats without collapsing. This resilience was a testament to both his strategic foresight and his psychological insight. He had created not just wealth and power, but a living system capable of self-preservation. Yet for all its efficiency, Luciano's empire relied heavily on human behavior. Loyalty, fear, and respect remained critical components of operational success. Associates were carefully selected, trained, and monitored. Betrayal was met with calculated retribution, while compliance and competence were rewarded. The psychological architecture of his organization, rooted in the principles of omerta, trust, and fear, ensured that human capital was managed as rigorously as money or territory. In this way, Luciano's empire was both economic and psychological, blending management, strategy, and influence into a cohesive whole. By the end of this period, Lucky Luciano had transformed organized crime into something unprecedented. A structured, disciplined, and profitable enterprise that integrated multiple industries, managed human behavior, and leveraged both perception and influence. He had taken a chaotic, fragmented underworld and turned it into a system of interlocking operations, capable of generating wealth, power, and control with remarkable efficiency. The American Mafia, as it would be known, was no longer a collection of violent gangs. It was a coordinated, resilient organization, and Luciano was its architect. In essence, Section 8 reveals Luciano not just as a criminal, but as a visionary strategist, a psychological manipulator, and an operational genius. By transforming disorder into a structured empire, he demonstrated that the underworld could be more than reactive and violent. It could be predictive, organized, and profit-driven. The foundations laid during this period would allow him to dominate the criminal landscape for decades, shaping both the economy and culture of organized crime in America. His empire was not merely about money or territory, it was about control, foresight, and the ability to orchestrate human behavior at scale, a testament to the unique combination of intellect, ambition, and audacity that defined Lucky Luciano. By the early 1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire was flourishing, but power in the underworld was never absolute. For every ally he cultivated, there was a rival observing, waiting, and scheming. The balance between loyalty and betrayal was precarious. One misstep could trigger violence, chaos, or the collapse of carefully constructed networks. Allies were essential, but they were also potential threats. Rivals were a constant hazard, their ambitions fueled by envy, fear, and the allure of opportunity. Navigating this treacherous web required not only intelligence and ruthlessness, but a profound understanding of human behavior, a skill at which Luciano excelled. Luciano's closest allies were selected with meticulous care. He sought individuals who combined loyalty with competence, ambition with discretion, and courage with strategic thinking. These lieutenants, captains, and partners were not merely enforcers. They were extensions of his vision, capable of executing complex operations and managing their own networks of influence. In return, they were rewarded with power, wealth, and protection, creating a symbiotic relationship in which loyalty became both a psychological and economic incentive. Luciano understood that by empowering his allies, he strengthened the resilience and reach of his empire. Yet even the most trusted allies could be sources of tension. The Mafia was a world in which ambition often exceeded loyalty, and disputes could erupt over money, territory, or perceived slights. Luciano's genius was his ability to anticipate conflict, mediate disputes, and maintain control without unnecessary bloodshed. He understood that leadership in the underworld required more than charisma. It required constant vigilance, negotiation, and the psychological management of human desires. By balancing reward and punishment, he ensured that alliances remained functional even when tensions threatened to erupt. Rivalry, of course, was unavoidable. Figures such as Vito Genovese, Meyer Lansky, and Frank Costello were not just contemporaries. They were formidable personalities with their own ambitions and followings. Some were allies at one moment, competitors the next, and enemies at times depending on shifting circumstances. Luciano's strategic insight allowed him to navigate these relationships with nuance. He knew when to align interests, when to manipulate perceptions, and when to assert dominance through calculated aggression. These maneuvers required psychological finesse. One misjudgment could ignite a war that destabilized the entire organization. Betrayal was a constant specter in this world. The stakes were high, and ambition often overrode loyalty. Luciano's approach to betrayal was systematic. It was not suppressed by paranoia, but anticipated and managed. He identified potential threats, assessed their motives, and either neutralized them before they could act or integrated them into his broader strategy. His ability to turn rivals into allies, or at least neutral parties, was a key component of his enduring dominance. It was this strategic flexibility that distinguished him from mobsters who relied solely on violence or intimidation. Alliances and rivalries extended beyond the Mafia itself. Luciano was adept at forging cross-ethnic partnerships, particularly with Jewish and Irish gangs, understanding that collaboration could multiply profit and reduce unnecessary conflict. Meyer Lansky, for example, was not just an associate but a critical partner in the expansion of gambling and bootlegging operations. These alliances were carefully calibrated, ensuring mutual benefit while maintaining Luciano's ultimate authority. By transcending ethnic and organizational boundaries, he expanded both his influence and the stability of his empire. The psychological dynamics of power were never far from Luciano's mind. Fear, respect, and loyalty were levers to be manipulated in concert. Allies needed to believe in his competence, rivals needed to perceive his reach, and subordinates needed to recognize the consequences of disobedience. Luciano's mastery of this psychological architecture allowed him to control networks of people who were inherently self-interested, ambitious, and often violent. His leadership was a combination of incentive, intimidation, and strategic foresight, a balance that few could maintain in such a volatile environment. Internal conflicts were managed through both negotiation and decisive action. Luciano was willing to employ violence, but it was always strategic, targeted, and calibrated to reinforce authority rather than provoke chaos. By contrast, impulsive or poorly timed aggression could destabilize operations and erode trust. He understood that the appearance of control was as important as control itself. Demonstrations of strength were necessary to maintain fear and respect, but they had to be credible, measured, and purposeful. In this way, Luciano transformed the threat of violence into a psychological tool, enforcing compliance and shaping behavior without constantly resorting to bloodshed. The relationships Luciano managed were constantly evolving. Today's ally could become tomorrow's rival, depending on shifting circumstances, ambitions, and opportunities. Navigating this fluid environment required flexibility, vigilance, and the ability to read human behavior with precision. Luciano's success lay not only in his strategic mind but in his ability to understand the underlying psychology of every player in the underworld. He anticipated desires, fears, and likely reactions, using this insight to influence outcomes before they became crises. By consolidating power, managing alliances, and neutralizing threats, Luciano was able to maintain dominance even as the stakes escalated. His empire was resilient, adaptive, and disciplined, capable of weathering internal strife and external pressure. Allies were empowered, rivals were managed, and subordinates operated within a structured system reinforced by both reward and fear. Through these dynamics, he created a psychological and organizational ecosystem in which loyalty, respect, and obedience were cultivated and reinforced. Ultimately, Section 9 illustrates that Luciano's rise was not a product of brute force alone, but of strategic acumen, psychological insight, and meticulous management of human relationships. Allies were cultivated, rivals neutralized, and betrayal anticipated. By blending diplomacy, intimidation, and foresight, Luciano maintained control over an empire defined by volatility and ambition. The web of power he navigated was complex, fluid, and dangerous, but his ability to understand, influence, and manipulate human behavior ensured that he emerged as the dominant figure in a world where loyalty was fragile and ambition was relentless. In the end, Luciano's mastery of alliances and rivalries reveals a central truth about power. It is not merely the possession of force, but the ability to shape perception, manage relationships, and anticipate human behavior. Through these skills, he maintained dominance in a world defined by chaos, conflict, and constant danger, a testament to his unique combination of intellect, ambition, and psychological insight. The empire he built was not only resilient but adaptive, capable of enduring the shifting tides of human ambition and the constant threats of betrayal. Despite the empire Luciano meticulously built, the underworld remained a perilous place, and even the most calculated plans could be upended by forces beyond his control. By the mid-1930s, the Mafia faced increasing scrutiny from law enforcement, rival factions, and political pressures. The romanticized notion of organized crime as a realm of untouchable power was quickly colliding with a reality where survival required not just strategy and violence, but adaptability and cunning. This period, often referred to as the Hidden War, tested Luciano's ability to protect his empire, manage threats, and navigate the tightening noose of legal and governmental oversight. The hidden war was multi-layered. On one level, it was the ongoing struggle between rival families and factions vying for territory, influence and control over revenue streams. While Luciano had established systems of order, human ambition and resentment never fully disappeared. Skirmishes, subtle power plays and acts of intimidation were constant, and he had to balance the use of force with diplomacy to maintain authority. Even a single miscalculation could spark violent reprisals, undermining both loyalty and operational stability. For Luciano, every decision carried strategic weight, as the costs of error could reverberate across the entire organization. Law enforcement presented another equally daunting threat. The FBI and local police were beginning to recognize the sophistication and scale of Luciano's operations, and political pressure was mounting to crack down on organized crime. Corruption within the police and political ranks offered some protection, but it was inconsistent and increasingly unreliable. Luciano understood that survival in this environment required subtlety as much as audacity. Public displays of violence or unchecked expansion could provoke attention that would jeopardize his empire. In response, he relied on discretion, intelligence networks, and careful manipulation of information to stay several steps ahead of those who sought to dismantle his power. Government pressure forced Luciano to innovate in his approach to management. The traditional model of visible dominance, predicated on fear and intimidation, was too risky under increased scrutiny. He began to delegate operational visibility, ensuring that lieutenants and associates executed activities without directly implicating him. This decentralization allowed the empire to function smoothly while shielding its architect. Luciano's psychological insight was evident here. He recognized that perception mattered as much as reality. To the outside world, the empire appeared fragmented or disorganized, masking the centralized control that allowed it to thrive. The hidden war also involved strategic alliances with unexpected partners. Luciano's pragmatism extended beyond ethnicity or traditional criminal boundaries. Jewish, Irish, and even certain political connections became tools to neutralize threats, access resources, and expand influence. He cultivated relationships with individuals who could provide intelligence, protection, or leverage, turning potential vulnerabilities into assets. This ability to manipulate social and political networks was critical to his survival, demonstrating that Luciano's genius extended beyond brute force to encompass strategic negotiation, foresight, and psychological leverage. Rival factions tested his authority at every opportunity. Ambitious figures challenged his control over territories, revenue streams, and personnel. These conflicts were not always resolved through violence. In many cases, Luciano employed negotiation, coercion, or subtle psychological manipulation to neutralize threats without destabilizing the broader system. His approach relied on understanding the motivations, fears, and ambitions of those around him. By predicting behavior and calibrating responses, he maintained dominance even in the face of persistent challenges. The hidden war also encompassed the manipulation of public perception. Luciano understood that media narratives, political rhetoric, and societal opinion could shape the environment in which his empire operated. Carefully orchestrated acts of charity, controlled violence, and displays of loyalty reinforced his image as a powerful yet disciplined leader. Conversely, rivals or disloyal associates who drew unwanted attention were neutralized swiftly. In this way, Luciano controlled not only operations and people, but the broader perception of power itself, reinforcing authority in subtle but profound ways. Economic threats, too, required strategic foresight. Competitors, both within and outside the Mafia, attempted to undermine revenue streams through sabotage, market manipulation, or alliances with law enforcement. Luciano responded with intelligence-driven decision-making, monitoring rival operations, predicting their moves, and preemptively securing strategic advantages. Bootlegging, gambling, and labor rackets were managed as integrated systems, ensuring that disruptions in one area did not cascade into failures elsewhere. This approach was remarkably sophisticated for a criminal enterprise, demonstrating Luciano's ability to merge operational acumen with psychological and economic strategy. Crucially, the hidden war was not purely external, it was also internal. Maintaining cohesion within the ranks required constant attention, reinforcement of loyalty, and careful psychological management. Associates were rewarded for competence, disciplined for disobedience, and constantly reminded of the consequences of betrayal. By controlling both incentives and fear, Luciano maintained a delicate balance, ensuring that internal threats were mitigated even as external pressures increased. This dual focus, on internal stability and external defense, was a hallmark of his leadership. Luciano's survival tactics during this period illustrate the intersection of strategy, psychology, and adaptability. He relied on foresight, intelligence networks, and a deep understanding of human behavior to navigate a landscape fraught with danger. Violence was a tool, but one employed judiciously. Alliances were strategic yet flexible. Information was weaponized but also carefully controlled. Every decision reflected a careful calculation of risk and reward, demonstrating that the hidden war was as much a battle of intellect and psychology as it was of firepower. By the end of this period, Luciano had successfully weathered pressures from rivals, law enforcement, and political forces, maintaining control of his empire while continuing to expand influence and revenue. His ability to survive and thrive in this environment was a testament to his strategic genius and psychological insight. The hidden war was not a single battle but an ongoing test of adaptability, perception, and leadership, a test that Luciano passed with remarkable skill. In essence, this phase of Luciano's life reveals the complexity of power in the underworld. Dominance was not simply the result of violence or intimidation. It required foresight, negotiation, and the ability to manipulate both human behavior and perception. The hidden war demanded constant vigilance, strategic flexibility, and an understanding of the intricate dynamics of loyalty, fear, and ambition. Luciano's ability to navigate this environment ensured not only the survival of his empire but also its continued growth, setting the stage for his later trials and cementing his legacy as the master architect of the modern American Mafia. Even the most meticulously constructed empire can be vulnerable to forces it cannot fully control. For Lucky Luciano, the rise that had seemed unstoppable began to meet the first signs of instability in the late 1930s. Despite his careful orchestration of loyalty, fear, and perception, cracks began to appear. Small betrayals, unexpected law enforcement pressure, and political shifts foreshadowed a confrontation with the law that would mark the beginning of his fall. What made Luciano's story so compelling was not merely his arrest, but the psychological complexity of this descent. How a man who had orchestrated an empire from chaos now faced the vulnerability of being human, exposed, and constrained. The seeds of Luciano's downfall were sown in the very success that had elevated him. His empire, sprawling and profitable, drew attention from federal authorities who had begun to recognize the scale, organization, and influence of the Mafia. While local corruption had previously offered protection, the federal apparatus was more systematic, more persistent, and less susceptible to bribery. Law enforcement pressure increased as investigative techniques improved, surveillance intensified, and informants emerged from within the ranks of his organization. Even a figure as strategic as Luciano could not entirely shield himself from this expanding net of scrutiny. Betrayal, an ever-present shadow in the Mafia, played a critical role. Allies who had once been loyal began to make deals with authorities, motivated by self-preservation or greed. Informants, tempted by reduced sentences or financial incentives, began to disclose details of operations that were previously secure. This erosion of trust forced Luciano into a defensive posture, requiring him to carefully evaluate whom he could still rely upon and whom he could not. The psychological impact of such betrayals cannot be overstated. A leader whose authority depends on loyalty must also confront the reality that loyalty is conditional and fragile. Luciano's arrest was the culmination of these converging pressures. Charged with running prostitution rings and racketeering operations, he was suddenly exposed to the very system of law enforcement he had long evaded. The arrest was more than a personal threat. It was a direct challenge to the empire he had built, signaling to associates and rivals alike that even the most dominant figure could be vulnerable. The timing and circumstances of the arrest demonstrated the increasing reach of federal authorities and the limits of even the most sophisticated criminal networks when confronted with organized, systemic enforcement. The psychological dimensions of this fall were profound. Luciano, who had thrived on control, structure, and foresight, was suddenly operating within a framework where he was no longer the architect of outcomes. He faced interrogation, legal maneuvering, and the judgment of a public that was eager to see a powerful figure brought low. The confrontation with the law stripped him of the operational omnipotence he had enjoyed, forcing him to confront vulnerability, mortality, and the limits of human influence. Yet even in this adversity, his strategic mind remained active, plotting avenues to maintain influence despite incarceration. In the midst of this turbulence, internal loyalty was tested. Associates had to decide whether to stand by him or protect their own interests. Some fled, others conspired, and a few remained steadfast. This period exposed the delicate architecture of human relationships within the empire. Alliances built on mutual gain and fear could be disrupted when stakes shifted and survival became paramount. Luciano's response to these fractures was a mixture of calculated negotiation, strategic concessions, and psychological manipulation, demonstrating once again his ability to maintain influence even under extreme pressure. Media attention amplified the pressure. The sensationalism surrounding his arrest transformed Luciano from a shadowy figure into a public spectacle. Headlines emphasized scandal, corruption, and vice, casting him simultaneously as a symbol of fear and fascination. Public perception became another battlefield, and Luciano understood that managing this narrative was as important as navigating courts or criminal networks. Reputation, after all, had been central to his power. Now the court of public opinion threatened to undermine it, and with it, the loyalty and fear that sustained his empire. Luciano's response to this existential threat highlighted his adaptability. Even as he faced incarceration, he orchestrated strategies to maintain influence over operations outside prison walls. Trusted lieutenants were empowered to act autonomously yet remained bound by the systems and codes he had established. By ensuring continuity in leadership, he protected the empire from collapse, demonstrating that his genius extended beyond active management to the creation of resilient structures that could withstand shocks. Even in apparent vulnerability, he remained the central architect of his criminal world. The arrest also revealed the tension between myth and reality. Luciano had cultivated an aura of invincibility, projecting control, intellect, and ruthlessness. Yet the legal system, unpredictable human behavior, and systemic enforcement exposed the limitations of even his extraordinary capabilities. This contrast between perception and reality underscores the human dimension of power. No empire, however well constructed, is immune to forces beyond its architect's control. The fall begins not merely in courtrooms, but in the psychological space where certainty meets contingency. Finally, the beginning of Luciano's downfall illustrates the fragile interplay between ambition, power, and consequence. The empire he had built, predicated on foresight, discipline, and psychological insight, was tested by forces that could not be entirely managed: law, betrayal, and circumstance. His arrest marked not the end of influence, but the start of a new phase, one in which survival, negotiation, and adaptation became the tools of continued power. It is a reminder that even the most calculated rises are vulnerable, and that the architecture of empire must always contend with the unpredictability of human behavior and external forces. In sum, the beginning of Luciano's fall is not a simple story of criminal hubris. It is a psychological and strategic saga. It reveals the vulnerabilities inherent in power, the fragility of loyalty, and the relentless pressures of law, society, and human ambition. Even as the first cracks appeared, Luciano's intellect, foresight, and adaptability ensured that his empire remained resilient. This phase of his life captures the tension between domination and vulnerability, illustrating the complex human dimensions of control, ambition, and survival in the shadowed world of organized crime. The trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a legal proceeding, it was a theatrical collision of power, morality, and public fascination. By the late 1930s, his empire was under unprecedented scrutiny, and the courtroom became a stage upon which the consequences of ambition, loyalty, and betrayal were laid bare. For the public, it was a spectacle of crime and vice. For Luciano, it was a battleground of strategy, psychology, and survival. Every word spoken, every motion made, had the potential to influence not only the verdict but the perception of his power, both within his empire and in the world beyond the courtroom walls. Luciano's trial was a study in contrasts. On one side stood the state, determined to dismantle the carefully constructed networks he had built over decades. Prosecutors presented evidence that illustrated the scope of his criminal enterprise: bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and racketeering. Witnesses, some coerced and some willing, described the organization's operations with chilling detail. The courtroom was both literal and symbolic territory. The battle over his freedom mirrored the larger struggle for control over the underworld itself. For Luciano, every revelation was a test of composure, cunning, and psychological fortitude. The defense, orchestrated with precision, highlighted a key element of Luciano's genius: perception. He projected confidence, intelligence, and calculated detachment, maintaining an aura that suggested control even in circumstances where he was technically vulnerable. Observers noted his ability to read the room, anticipate questions, and respond in ways that maintained credibility while subtly influencing jurors and the public. This psychological mastery was as critical as any legal argument. In an environment where image and perception shaped outcomes, Luciano's composure became an extension of his power. Betrayal and loyalty played out vividly in the courtroom drama. Associates who had once operated under his authority were compelled to testify, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes under pressure. The revelations underscored the fragility of human loyalty, even within the tightly controlled world of the Mafia. For Luciano, this was both a challenge and an opportunity. By carefully managing relationships with cooperating witnesses, leveraging legal maneuvering and maintaining his own psychological dominance, he sought to minimize the damage while preserving his influence and authority beyond the courtroom. Media coverage amplified the stakes. Newspapers and radio broadcasts sensationalized the trial, painting Luciano as both a monster and a symbol of the audacious power of organized crime. Public perception, shaped by these narratives, added pressure on the judicial process and colored the social and political context of the proceedings. Luciano's understanding of reputation, cultivated over decades, became a strategic tool. Even while constrained by law, he continued to manipulate the perceptions of allies, rivals, and the broader society. In a sense, the trial was not only about legal guilt but about maintaining control over his public image and the loyalty of those still within his network. The courtroom drama also revealed the psychological dimensions of power. Luciano had spent decades mastering human behavior, aligning fear, loyalty, and opportunity to sustain his empire. Now he faced an environment where these levers were inverted. Intimidation had limits, loyalty was tested under duress, and perception could be weaponized against him. Yet even under these conditions, Luciano remained a master of strategic psychology. He projected calm authority, anticipated adversaries' moves, and subtly guided the narrative to protect both himself and the structure of his empire. One of the most striking aspects of the trial was its moral complexity. Luciano's actions had generated immense wealth and influence, but at a cost measured in human suffering, exploitation, and betrayal. The courtroom became a moral arena in which society grappled with the tension between admiration for his intellect and revulsion at his methods. For Luciano himself, the trial may have represented a moment of reflection. The realization that the very strategies that had propelled him to the apex of power could also be scrutinized, challenged, and punished. This moral turning point highlighted the paradox of criminal mastery. Brilliance and ruthlessness could build empires, but they could also provoke justice in ways that even the most cunning could not entirely anticipate. The trial also underscored the role of adaptability in survival. Luciano could no longer rely solely on the empire he had built. He had to navigate legal constraints, media scrutiny, and shifting loyalties with precision. Strategies that worked in the streets and backrooms of New York had to be translated into courtroom tactics and public perception management. This phase demonstrated that the true test of power was not merely domination, but the ability to adapt and assert influence in contexts far removed from one's initial domain of control. In the end, the trial resulted in a conviction that marked a turning point in Luciano's life and the narrative of the Mafia itself. The sentence, while devastating, did not entirely dismantle the empire he had constructed. Through careful delegation, strategic foresight, and psychological influence, Luciano continued to exert control from within confinement. Yet the trial symbolized a shift, from unchecked power to contested authority, from freedom to constraint, and from the unassailable apex of influence to a precarious balance of survival and control. Section 12 illustrates that Luciano's genius was as much about psychology and strategy as it was about crime. Even under the intense pressure of a public trial, facing betrayal, moral scrutiny, and legal jeopardy, he managed to project authority, shape perception, and protect his empire. The courtroom became a crucible, testing not only his intellect but his ability to maintain influence in the face of systemic opposition. It was a vivid reminder that power, while potent, is always contingent upon perception, human behavior, and adaptability. Ultimately, the trial represents both an endpoint and a beginning. It marked the public acknowledgement of his criminal activities, the moral reckoning of his empire, and the first stage of a new chapter in which survival and strategic influence became as critical as the raw exercise of power. The courtroom was more than a legal arena. It was a theater in which the dynamics of loyalty, betrayal, fear, and authority played out in full view of the world. For Luciano, it was another stage on which his mastery of strategy, psychology, and human behavior would continue to define his legacy. Even behind the cold iron bars of prison, Lucky Luciano's influence remained formidable. Confinement could limit his movements, but it could not diminish his capacity for strategy, perception, and psychological control. He relied on trusted lieutenants to manage operations, bootlegging, gambling, and labor rackets, ensuring his empire continued to function seamlessly. Delegation, combined with strict adherence to loyalty and discipline, allowed his influence to extend far beyond the prison walls. Luciano's greatest weapon was information. By cultivating relationships with prison officials, other inmates, and intermediaries outside, he stayed informed of law enforcement activity, rival movements, and internal disputes. Knowledge became a means to maintain authority, turning perception into power. Fear and respect were carefully calibrated. Disobedience carried consequences, while loyalty was rewarded with protection, opportunity, and profit. Even in confinement, he maintained the appearance of omnipresence, reinforcing obedience and psychological dominance. Prison also afforded strategic patience. Free from immediate operational pressures, Luciano observed, planned, and manipulated outcomes with clarity. His empire was resilient because of the structures he had built, decentralized yet disciplined, flexible yet coordinated. Confinement revealed the enduring strength of his organizational genius, proving that true power is less about proximity and more about systems, influence, and foresight. Luciano's control behind bars cemented his reputation as a mastermind whose authority transcended walls, reminding both allies and rivals that dominance is ultimately psychological as well as operational. In 1946, Luciano was deported to Italy, severing his direct control over the empire he had built in America. Exile was both punishment and reflection, a period in which he confronted the consequences of ambition, loss of freedom, and the enduring myth of his power. While he no longer wielded authority in New York, the legend of his intellect, strategic foresight, and psychological mastery persisted. Allies continued to respect his authority, and former rivals remembered the skill with which he had neutralized threats. Even from afar, Luciano influenced operations through trusted intermediaries, demonstrating that power is not tied to geography but to perception, relationships, and strategic insight. He adapted to new challenges in Italy, applying the same principles of negotiation, foresight, and psychological manipulation that had defined his rise. Exile allowed him a rare opportunity for reflection on the moral costs of his empire, the lives lost, betrayals endured, and the human consequences of unrelenting ambition. Luciano's legacy is both concrete and symbolic. The empire he built endured, shaping the methods, strategies, and psychology of organized crime for generations. Yet his life also offers a cautionary reflection. The pursuit of power carries consequences, and even the most brilliant strategies are subject to human limitation, law, and mortality. Exile illuminated both the enduring influence of his intellect and the human vulnerabilities behind the myth. Lucky Luciano remains a figure whose empire, legend, and psychological mastery transcended borders, law, and time, a testament to the complex interplay of power, ambition, and legacy.